So let's talk a little bit about posing. So what makes an appealing pose? So the four main things we want to be thinking about as we get into our shots are: who is your character? What are they thinking about in this moment? What is the context? And is the subtext clear? And so, that's why I've been kind of asking you guys to think about the backstory of your characters, not because the viewer is necessarily going to know every detail of that backstory, but because by understanding who the character is, you'll be able to make more informed acting decisions. And when you're posing it out, it'll give you more ideas of kind of little quirks and things you can add to your character to make them more entertaining. So this first principle I want to talk about is line of action. So this is the flow, the direction of energy created by your character's pose. The idea here is to add as much clarity as possible in one image as to what your character is doing and tell your audience where to look, right? You're directing the eye of the viewer, focusing their attention where you want it to go. And it can also tell us about the dynamic between different characters in the shot. But first, just keeping it simple, let's look at these two images of Tom. So on the left here, this is a very confusing pose because your eye doesn't quite know where to go. Like if your eye starts down here at his toe, you can kind of get pulled in a lot of different directions, right? You have all of these disparate angles that are kind of just meshed together. So your eye might get distracted and go to his tail, which is kind of this weird, like geometric shape. He's got this, this toe, this heel is up. This is just kind of a mess. And his arms feel very disjointed. His head is kind of rotated in the opposite direction, which makes it feel very broken. And his limbs just, again, feel kind of disjointed. Whereas here, you have this very clean line of action, right? So your eye goes from his toe straight up his leg along this nice smooth curve all the way to the tip of the newspaper, right? And even these details like on the tail supports this line of action. It's kind of following that same curve. His head is oriented in the same direction as the line of action. So you get this nice clean line. And without even thinking about it, your brain is going to put together what he's about to do. Obviously, he's about to smack this paper down. But even getting more specific, you can almost tell exactly where the end of that newspaper is going to land. Because you have this super clear line of action, your brain kind of can imagine that it's about to invert and go like, so he's about to curve the other way. And so you can kind of, without seeing any motion, you can follow exactly where this newspaper is going to smack down. And so again, you're just telling the viewer where to look, giving us that anticipation in one frame. And this was kind of something that I remember I didn't get this right away when I started animating like in college. I remember my first few animations, I relied a lot on motion to tell the viewer what's happening. Right. So for example, if like a character is like landing a punch, if you see the character in motion and you see the fist go from point A to point B and it makes contact with something, like you'll register that, he's making contact with something, and the motion does tell you something about what's happening. But the idea here, when we're talking about these principles, is getting all of that information from one image without any motion, right? So like in this image of Tom, we can tell that he's just done this. We can kind of see the motion without actually seeing more than one frame, if that makes sense. The line of action accomplishes a few different things. One is direction of force. So a lot of animation is about physics, right? And Newton's laws of motion come into play all the time. I believe it's the third law of motion is, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, which basically means like if you push on a wall, the wall exerts a force back, so the wall kind of pushes against you. So if you look at this image of Mr. Incredible pushing against this machine, you can tell that they're both exerting force, because first you see this arm is fully extended. We can tell it's applying a force, and then Mr. Incredible, we can follow his line of action, from his heel, straight through his arms to his hands, and and we can tell that they're applying equal force to one another, and those forces are canceling each other out. But we get a lot of information from the pose, right? That he's fully outstretched. All of his weight is pushing against this machine. So we get all that information right away from the line of action. And then this is a great image from Incredibles 2, where, again, we have this nice, clear line of action going from this character's foot straight through her body, up through her arm. And we can tell that she's just like smashed Violet up against the wall, because we can see the direction of force from her pose and from this line of action. And we can also pick up a lot from Violet's pose too, right? Like we can see that her hair is kind of flowing behind her. I think that's Newton's first law, is that an object in motion stays in motion. And so like if you're moving and all of a sudden, she gets smashed up against this wall, like when this character's head stops, her hair keeps flowing in this direction. And same thing with Violet's hair. We see that equal and opposite reaction. As her hair kind of goes flying in the other direction. And so we can tell a lot just from this one image of what the action is and where the force is being applied. And then I wanted to throw this image of Sully in there. This is a much simpler pose, because all the same principles apply here. So in this pose, he's leaning up against this pile of canisters, and his weight is almost fully supported by these canisters, and he's pushing down on the canisters. And as a result, the canisters are pushing his shoulder up, right? We can see his shoulder gets pushed up here. And that affects the whole pose, right? Because that shoulder comes up, which pushes this shoulder down. And then we have this nice, natural leaning pose where we can see exactly where his weight is supported. Feels very natural. So we also want to think about what the line of action tells us about the relationship between two characters in the shot and the emotion of each character. So yeah, the mother is higher in frame, which makes her feel more in control. She has, multiple, so her head and her body is coming up over Coraline, but then she has this spindly arm that creates this other line of action that's coming from below, right? And it feels like she's just encroaching on Coraline. And Coraline is kind of just stuffed into the corner of the frame here. And it makes the mother feel like a spider, right? Because she literally is a spider, right? And she makes her feel very predatory. And so, yeah, you have this very strong composition where it's just, pushing her into the corner. And this big villain is just, kind of creeping in.